Thank you for tuning in to From the Cowboy State podcast. I'm your host, Michaela Getz, agriculture and natural resources educator with University of Wyoming Extension. Today we have with us Rob Ziegler. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him and let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Michaela. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast. So I just started with Extension in February, and I was hired to be the livestock production and marketing specialist. And to your listeners, some of the things that I'm supposed to deliver educational content on around the state would be things like market outlook, price outlook, helping producers with partial budgeting strategies, risk mitigation strategies, just to name a few. I am housed in the Agriculture and Applied Economics Department.
Mm-hmm. On campus in Laramie.
On campus in Laramie, that's right.
That's great. So clearly we've covered you work with Extension with a multitude of hats, but how did you actually come to work in Wyoming? Because you're not from Wyoming, right?
That's right. So if we backtrack a little bit, my previous role, I worked for TELUS Agriculture in Alberta, Canada, just south of Calgary. I worked with a team of people there that really focused on the end of the production cycle and let's say maximizing returns when cattle were harvested. It was a really data heavy company and a unique business model to use individual producers' data to help them think through some decisions.
Sure. And it sounds like that really set you up for success in this role too.
For sure. And so I guess one of the attractions to come work in Extension at the University of Wyoming is supporting the land grant mission.
Right.
Those three pillars being teaching, research, and extension. And
Absolutely.
That was the attraction.
Absolutely. Great. So something that, even though we've only had one episode, but I'm going to start asking everybody, so I'm going to ask you, what does agriculture really mean to you?
Yes. A bit of a loaded question, but
Sure.
When I think of agriculture, I really think of one of the pillars of our economy. Outside of that, from a personal connection, I think of, a lot of agriculture enterprises are family oriented.
Right.
Deeply rooted in their communities, focused around education.
Absolutely.
And I think another piece that comes into the agriculture sphere is technology.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that's not necessarily talked about enough is the technology aspect. When we talk about agriculture and family and education, I think, we all come from, let me back up, I guess, we don't all come from that agriculture background in our families necessarily. I think we are blessed in the fact that we were born and raised in that. That's where my passion from agriculture comes from, seeing my dad so integrated in it, my grandpa, my great-grandpa, my brother. He loved nothing more than being in a tractor, just going up and down the rows, corn, soybean family, everything like that. But really the technology of, John Deere releasing their, I don't know the exact model, but their AI technology in their tractors, that's something brand new that is coming out. And so I think that's a really important component that we're going to just keep seeing evolving and evolving. And I think you're going to talk about that more a little bit later. So we'll get into that. But no, I think that's a really interesting component. So to jump ahead a little bit, we're going to talk about cattle prices today. That's the whole purpose of our episode, those who are listening in, wondering what we were going to cover today. So it would be safe to assume, or it could be safe to assume, that everybody tuning in, as we just covered, either works in, grew up in, came from a background of agriculture and or the beef industry. That's not necessarily true. Maybe folks don't know about extension or didn't know about extension. So let's just kind of pinpoint some terms for everybody. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to kick these over to you.
Sure.
We'll just kind of run down a list real quick. So what, in your just simplistic terms, is a cow-calf operation?
Yeah, so I got a really interesting perspective on how we communicate our story to the public.
Sure.
Just here recently, I attended the Canadian Cattle Young Leaders Spring Forum, and that was in Ontario, Canada. One of the sessions that kicked that off was Crystal McKay from Loft 32, and she's really focused on, self-awareness and branding and how we portray ourselves to the general public. And so one of the eye-opening things to me is, and back to your question, we're going to define a cow-calf operation. If you were in a more urban setting and you said, oh, that's a cow-calf operation,
Right.
the public perspective of that is a C-section or a cesarean section. So, and it makes sense, right? An operation
Sure.
is something you get done at the emergency room.
Right.
For, I think, most of our listeners and people in the ag community, the cow-calf operation is an enterprise developed on cows and them reproducing calves. And
Absolutely.
so that's the broad spectrum of cow-calf operation.
Absolutely.
It's a lot more intricate than that, but essentially at the end of the day, that's what it is.
So the next term for us to go through, because we see this across the nation, are dairy cow operations.
Yeah, so when I think of a dairy, I mean, the immediate thing I think of is, milk production. But we can't forget about all the other things that comes out of dairies, like yogurt, cream, and whey.
Yep.
I actually spent a fair bit of my early days in agriculture working for a producer that raised dairy replacement heifers. So that industry in and of itself is pretty broad in scope. When I think of a dairy cow operation, I'm thinking of milk,
Right.
yogurt, whey, and all the products that come from that.
Right.
And let's not forget about ice cream.
Of course, ice cream, the most important product. And again, just for listeners, can we talk about whey a little bit?
We can. We'll say that's outside of my maybe area of expertise, but go for it.
So whey protein, and I am not by any means a big protein product consumer unless it is in the form of beef, chicken, meat of some sort. But whey, when you buy that in your protein powder form, that's just the watery byproduct, right? That is separated when people are going through the cheese making process. And then it's processed, I think, down to a powder form. And then that is what is put into your actual protein powder. And that's the quote unquote whey protein. So again, next term that we're just defining for the audience, feedlots, which these are seen, I've seen them most across the Midwest, Nebraska, Kansas.
Yeah, so when I'm thinking about a feedlot, I'm thinking about sort of the last step in the live cattle production phase. And so typically those cattle are consuming a high concentrate diet that's scientifically formulated, usually by someone with a PhD in ruminant nutrition. And the whole idea is there to enhance the efficiency and produce high quality meat at the feedlot level.
Absolutely. Yep. And this was a term that I won't even lie to you, I had not heard much about seed stocks. I can't contribute anything here, Rob. This is all you.
Yeah. So seed stock producer to me in this part of the country for sure, and a lot of these definitions, you'll hear iterations of them a little bit different as you move around North America, we'll say. But the seed stock producer is really focused on enhancing genetics of the cow herd or producing bulls that have high quality genetic merit. And they typically have a intricate relationship with a cow-calf producer at some level.
That's great.
And so the cow-calf producer typically has a relationship with a seed stock producer where they go buy their bulls. Bull sales typically occur in early spring, late winter in this part of the world. There are some out there selling bulls in December. But seed stock, I'm thinking of producers focused on genetics. Typically, they've got a registered herd of some sort, and they're really selling their genetics to the cow-calf producer.
That makes sense. And then the last one, so backgrounders or growers.
Yeah, so the backgrounding operation would be a place, we'll just give an example. If we're weaning calves from the cow-calf operation in, let's just say, October, seems to be a pretty popular month to be weaning calves in Wyoming, those calves might go into a backgrounding program where they're fed maybe a higher roughage diet than what the feedlot would feed them.
Sure.
And maybe we're just going to put some frame on those cattle
Yep.
as opposed to muscle. And there's all different reasons why we might background. Typically, we might grow those cattle out for a period of time to hit a specific market, or sometimes we wean calves and put them right on feed depending on what market dynamics we're trying to meet.
Interesting. It's neat.
For sure. And I think the whole traceability from pasture to plate is going to be a bigger focus on the end consumer as we move into the future. So I think, as we mentioned earlier in our definition of agriculture, technology is going to play a very large role in getting that accomplished.
Well, and just the information that consumers want to know and
Exactly.
be aware of. Yeah. So, we've talked about some terms and everything there. Talked about what agriculture means to you, to me, etc. So, what trends were you seeing pre-pandemic? Since this is how we define time now, pre and post-pandemic.
Yeah.
What trends were you seeing in the markets before the pandemic?
Yeah, so we could probably backtrack a little bit to my introduction, and we could probably host a whole nother podcast on my history, and
Right.
I don't know that you'd have any listeners that want to be bored with that, but so I graduated with my master's degree from UNL in 2020.
Another
which was
UNL graduate.
the heat of the pandemic, so to speak.
Yeah.
So during my academic career, I'll say in my bachelor's degree and my master's program, I was, as my master's advisor, Travis Mullenix would say, very siloed into, at the time, was my academic career. So I'll be honest, I had to go back and look at some data as to what the market was doing during that time period. And so I guess the other thing for your listeners, I would encourage maybe students at the university or high school, the world is a lot broader than your thesis project.
Right. Absolutely.
That was one takeaway from that. So back to your question, what were markets doing? If we look at the feeder cattle market, we'll talk about Wyoming 5 to 6 weight calves. We'll say from 2016 to 2020, because remember back in 2014 and 15, we saw some pretty significant, or I should say high markets at that time point. So after that kind of cooled off in 2016 to 2020, average 5 to 6 weight steer calf in Wyoming was approximately $170 per hundredweight. And I'm giving you an average there, and we all know that with averages, there's numbers above and below, but essentially during that time period, things were somewhat status quo. If we look at the time period from the pandemic, we'll just say from 2020 to 2023, things stayed relatively consistent. That average price was $169.
Right.
And then at the start of 2023 is when, I'll use a Canadian reference here, if you were looking at a graph of these numbers, is quote unquote the hockey stick rally that started at that time period.
Right.
And here in the beginning of 2024, we broke that $300 per hundredweight mark. And so that's sort of the feeder cattle side of things. If we want to take a look at the live cattle and we just look at Nebraska prices, our neighbors to the east, again, we saw that rally in 2014 and 2015. That time period between 2016 and 2020, we were averaging 119 live for fat cattle. Relatively consistent through the pandemic. And then that hockey stick rally started in 2021, and we broke that 180 mark in the middle of 2023. And here in June, the Nebraska price sits just north of $190 a hundredweight. So I would say the start of 2023 essentially is when we started to see kind of that the markets really take off.
So if you are a cattleman, what does this mean for your operation? As someone who doesn't watch market prices all the time, and sorry, I'm throwing this at you kind of out of left or right field, whichever you prefer, but if you are a cattleman, what does this mean that maybe you should be doing with your operation?
Yeah, so it's a fine line we walk, right? Like I don't want to tell producers
No,
how
yeah,
to
no.
how to spend their money, but you know, certainly it's a time to be thinking about how can we maximize this
Mm-hmm.
opportunity for when the market corrects.
Mm-hmm.
Inevitably, things are going to change and be
Sure.
dynamic, and that will happen. So,
Sure.
things that I'm encouraging producers to think about is, really weigh the wants versus the needs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what things should we be investing in now that could pay off long term?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other thing to really be thinking about is it's really a cash flow was
Mm-hmm.
what it comes down to. Take advantage of these high times to get through some of the lows.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some management considerations we could be thinking about, any short-term or long-term debt. Can we get those paid down, save
Mm-hmm.
some interest? Um, any infrastructure upgrades, right? We've all heard the joke kind of, as I mentioned, being family oriented businesses, you've got mom and dad and the kids out there working
Right.
cattle. And it's a, agriculture can be a very stressful endeavor,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what sector you're in. And if we use this opportunity to, let's just say, upgrade our working facilities, in the long run, that could pay off. And our jobs are stressful enough. If we do a little upgrade right now, make our lives a little bit easier, so we don't have to scream at the kids or the wife or the husband for that matter.
Right.
The other thing, I'm a huge proponent of employee development.
Mm-hmm.
And so, maybe this is an opportunity to send your employees off to some sort of formal or informal
Sure.
training, and that could really pay off long term as well.
Absolutely. And to circle back on something you briefly mentioned, you talked a little bit about this being a family operation, training your employees, what have you, because a lot of times these operations are multi generational families, great uncles, great grandpas, cousins, nieces, nephews, etc. Does that make?
Yeah. So the other thing I think to consider, we talked about potentially sending employees off for professional development opportunities or informal um, educational programs. I think it'd be another really great time to think about diversification on the ranch.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, if this is a family enterprise, you might have one child that wants to come back to the ranch, but right now we're at capacity, right? So we
Mm-hmm.
need to be thinking about different enterprises that we could potentially spin off of the resources we already have. So if that child wants to come back to the ranch, there'd be another opportunity for them.
No, that makes absolute sense. So, we've talked about range diversification or operation diversification, pre pandemic trends. Were there any shifts that you saw in the markets immediately after the pandemic was considered quote unquote over, or kind of after that time period?
Yeah, so I guess one of the really big challenges, and a lot of the people that face this, it's nothing new here, but there was a major bottleneck at the packing plants during the pandemic,
Right.
um, and so that had trickle down effects throughout the beef production supply chain, which
Right.
we identified several of those different segments in the beginning, but really it worked backwards, and it was an eye-opening experience for the beef industry. And so one of the immediate things, and I actually had the opportunity to visit with someone from a large packing entity a few weeks ago, and one of the things that they've really focused on since then is a lot of automation in the packing plant. And I think we're going to see more of that, not just in the packing plant, but at all levels of beef production. The other thing I think that really came out of the pandemic is the niche market and direct to consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So here's another thing maybe we should identify for your audience, but direct to consumer in this sense being I'm a beef producer and now I'm going to, have those animals harvested, but then maybe I'm going to open up a roadside stand, for lack of better terms, to
Right.
sell some of those products,
A lemonade stand.
except better.
Except better. Yeah. We're selling meat, not lemonade.
Yeah, but I do appreciate the good 50-cent lemonade
Right.
roadside stand. And so I think that was one of the really big things that came out of the pandemic is, and even in Wyoming specifically, a lot of kind of those niche market direct to consumer
Right.
opportunities. And I know Texas A&M, I was actually at a conference in Salt Lake City this spring, and they received an award for some of the programming extension put out on that specifically.
Direct to consumer marketing not only has been interesting to watch for producers, but has been interesting, at least for me, to watch from an agricultural communication standpoint. Part of what I did for my graduate assistantship at Tarleton State University, which is I believe, considered sister school of Texas A&M, we had a store called the Purple Tractor at the Agricultural Center, and it was based off of Texas A&M's entity that was originally set up, which I don't want to misconstrue this. I don't know if the store at A&M's campus, which was originally set up by Extension, or if it was set up by campus entities, but it was based off of this store that is at A&M's Dairy, which sells their dairy-produced ice cream, I believe cheese, other products, that is all student manufactured, processed, and so that's almost the exact model that Tarleton has. Everything that is sold in store is processed by students, designed by students, manufactured, etc. And so what you have in that store at Tarleton's Agriculture Center is just a really neat way for the community to be able to give back, because then all of those proceeds go back into the college. And it's just really neat, but that's just kind of a way that direct-to-consumer marketing has, played a role there.
And if we go back to some of my earlier days and considering my different avenues as what I wanted to choose for a
Exactly.
career, there was a point in my time where I thought I wanted to be a vet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I came to my senses. But I went and toured Cornell University, and part of their dairy program is they have a similar direct-to-consumer type market that I believe is student-run.
Yep.
So yeah, and I think, coming back to the beef thing, that'd be one thing. I think that's come out of the pandemic. I certainly have some connections that have taken advantage of those markets.
So, as someone who doesn't check market trends / prices every day, and I'm sure maybe some other listeners don't as well, what trends do we see in the market right now when it comes to beef / cattle prices that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so I think now is the best time as any for the new livestock production and marketing specialist. I mean, there's a lot of optimism in the markets, and it's an exciting time to be part of this. We as economists can't ever, I guess, fully flesh out some of the risk that's involved, and some catastrophic event could really knock things off its kilter. But I would say things are looking quite optimistic out through 2025, 2026, and things somewhat taper off after there.
Absolutely. So, and I'm going to jump backwards a little bit. You were talking about the prices for your feeder cattle, or not yours, I'm sorry, but for feeder cattle and live cattle in general. Is it a fair statement to say that these are some record highs right now, or at least some trending highs?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think seems like every day we're breaking records of some capacity around the country.
So how have you seen these record highs then or I guess, let me rephrase that. Have you seen these record highs have any effects on how ranchers are managing their operations? You kind of offered some advice, but how have you seen these record highs have any effects on how ranchers are managing their operations?
Yeah, so if we think back to 2014 and 15, right, that was kind of the most recent environment where we experience prices like this, definitely there was a lot of new pickup purchases then, and infrastructure, and new
Sure.
shops, and all of that stuff is great. Um, the other thing to think about right now is, we think about the cow cycle, right? So
Mhm.
when our beef cow herd numbers are high versus when our beef
Right.
cow numbers are low. Right now, the answer to this question is different for every operation,
Right.
but there can be incentive to sell a heifer because, if you don't take advantage of the market right now, the chances of her paying herself off over her lifetime, um, don't know if that's going to be uh, doable or not. So, and again, that answer is different for everyone, but something to think about. On the other side of the story, Aaron Berger wrote a really good article, um, kind of focused on producers maybe thinking about retirement,
Right.
and right now taking advantage of the red cow market and some of the tax implications associated with that. It could be a time period where, ranchers considering to retire might be taking advantage of some of those opportunities.
Right.
The other thing we don't want to leave out of the discussion is with higher market prices, we also tend to see increased volatility.
Mm.
And so another thing we need to be thinking about is getting, some protection on market risk.
Interesting. Okay.
The final thought, I guess, on that is not to get complacent. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's easy for us to sit back and think, regardless of the inputs we put into our calves, we're going to take them, or maybe we're going to sell them on a video or whatever the case may be, and we're going to get $3 or better just because that's where the markets are. And I don't encourage that thought process because typically in this environment, when any additional inputs, the return on that investment is higher in a higher market.
Nope, that makes complete sense. So we've touched on this a little bit, but is there any additional advice that you would offer to not just Wyoming cattle ranchers, but ranchers across the nation on, not just managing their ranch, but how to capitalize on maybe these higher prices for now? Because, like you mentioned earlier, the market is bound to, at some point, hopefully not for a while, but at some point, it's going to take a dip, right? So, any additional advice other than what you previously mentioned?
Yeah, so I think some of the big things that we touched on, right, is maybe some professional development for employees,
Mm-hmm.
any machinery or equipment upgrades that are
Mm-hmm.
necessary,
Absolutely.
thinking about paying down debts, strategies to take advantage of these high markets to get through the low points, and um, thinking about different risk mitigation strategies
Right.
would be some of the big ticket items right now in this environment.
Absolutely. No, those are all great, great advice points. So, just a few more questions, Rob.
Yeah, sure.
So, one of the things that you had mentioned in one of our meetings last week, I believe, which I found really interesting, so I wanted to bring up for everybody to listen to. You travel not only across the state, but across the country, and you've been many, many places. And you've had a lot of different conversations and heard a lot of different viewpoints. And the other day, you had mentioned that you were conversing with McDonald Canada's CEO. And so I wanted to kind of get your point of view on what sets operations like the Pitchfork that spans from Wyoming to Texas, the Four Sixes, the King Ranch, the Deseret, operations like that apart from operations that are just a step below those. What sets them apart from those? And is it, do you think it's simply the amount of land or the amount of cattle, et cetera, or is it something else that you see?
Yeah, definitely. The land mass and the cattle's numbers plays a role into that. But I
Sure.
think out of all those ranches you mentioned, they're not just, say, cow-calf producers. They are diversified
Right.
in many different facets, whether that be, you know, horse enterprises or
Right.
direct consumer marketing. I mean, I think if you even went on their websites, you could buy ball caps and T-shirts, and
Merchandise,
right.
right.
If you go down to Deseret, you can buy oranges.
Right.
And so, point being, some of those large entities are very diversified across, as you had mentioned earlier in our conversation, the complete production
Mhm.
cycle of beef cattle. So,
Right.
the other thing I would think sets these ranches apart from others is, I would say, probably very diligent record keeping, financial management, are some of the keys to those really big enterprises.
Right. No, absolutely. And you make some good points there. Touching back on that direct to consumer, it's a great time to, if you are taking advantage, like you said, of these high market prices, this could be a good time to start a website. Take advantage of the direct to consumer
Yeah,
times.
that's a great point. And I think um, another thing to consider, agriculture in 2024 is much different than agriculture was in
Yes.
1994. And it's the digital world we live in right now.
Yes.
And, you know, maybe young people wanting to get into agriculture in some capacity,
Right.
it's a lot more than plowing the fields and baling the hay
It is.
and, branding the calves. There is an avenue, and I think, as you mentioned, websites,
Social media.
all of that stuff, there's a space in agriculture for someone,
Hmm.
for
Absolutely.
everyone, I guess I should say.
Absolutely. And I think it's safe to take a plug-in moment for University of Wyoming's new ranching management and agricultural leadership program that's starting up as well. It's a great program that is addressing some of these issues, whether you're new to ranching, whether you've been in ranching and just want to expand some of your skills. So don't hesitate to go on to University of Wyoming's website, and then under the College of Agriculture, Life Sciences, and Natural Resources, all of that information should be there, and then don't hesitate to reach out for more information. So, anyways, after taking that nice little break for the plug-in, Rob, just I promise a couple more questions. As an economics or markets man, as I have labeled you throughout this episode.
I've been called a lot worse, so that's okay.
A beef man, a cattleman. Everybody wants and hopes that you're a fortune teller, as I've also heard you deemed a few times. Uh, what do you see, hope, predict for the future of the cattle industry? Whether it's markets, cattle operations, etc.
Yeah. So a few things that come to mind. First one being precision agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
We think about integrating drones or GPS monitoring systems or different tools to evaluate pasture conditions, right? And so I see a bigger piece of precision agriculture,
Yeah.
and not just for beef production. I see that. I mean, you can crawl into a tractor right now, and it looks like you could land something on Mars, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think part of that is we're going to see data and analytics be a bigger part of how agriculture operations produce, right?
Absolutely.
And so, back to the thought process that we're just people out here plowing the fields and feeding the cows, it's a lot different space than it was 20 years ago. Also, I think moving into the future, sustainability is going to be a bigger piece of the conversation, and that's been
Right.
a buzzword around for quite some time. And I think I really like the definition that the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, their definition is a socially responsible, economically viable, and environmentally sound product that prioritizes the planet, people, animals, and progress. And so, as producers are out there thinking about this sustainability piece, we cannot ignore the economically viable. And granted, our careers in agriculture are incredibly rewarding, and it's not always just about the monetary value. It's about a lot of other things, uh, or reasons why we do what we do. But at the end of the day, we do need to provide food on the table and a place to live. And so, without economics being a part of that conversation, we're going to be left in the dust. The last piece I think we can't ignore is environmental risk, whether that be changes in weather patterns or whatever the case may be. The environmental risk within agriculture is also going to be a big portion of what we
Right.
deal with into the future.
Absolutely. No, I think those are all great points. And what you're talking about with precision agriculture, whether it comes to land surveys, soil monitoring, spraying pesticides, herbicides, I mean, it's all right there. If people aren't already doing it, they're going to be really, really soon. So, no, that's great. And I appreciate you bringing all of those points up, Rob. So, last, well, almost last question, but definitely not least. Other than, market trends and prices, what have you, are there just any other health trends, cattle trends, anything in general that you'd like to bring up or would like ranchers to be aware of?
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard for me not to deviate away from the markets, right? But a lot of the forecasting that I've looked at, things are optimistic, for the next couple years, and I think we need to really be thinking about risk protection, as volatility
Right.
is a big piece of what we're trying to minimize and protect ourselves against market risk, right?
Absolutely.
And I say this, and we can't rule out maybe catastrophic events that could turn things on their lid. So
Right.
just another point to drive home that we need to be thinking about risk mitigation strategies.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, Rob, thank you so much for taking this time. I know we've both had busy couple days. You've been traveling across multiple countries, really. And I know you have a lot going on this summer. So, is there anything specific University of Wyoming Extension wise / across the state that you'd like to share with
Yeah.
folks?
So definitely summertime is a busy season for fairs all across the state. But also thinking about the Research and Extension Center's field days.
Yes.
So PAL's coming up on July 19th, Sheridan's August 16th, and Lingle is August 22nd. Sarah Fleener up in Crook County is planning to host a meeting at the end of August. I agreed to be a part of
Great.
that conversation. So, keep a lookout on Facebook pages, et cetera, to see what's coming down the pipeline. Further out into the fall, I'm also helping plan Southeast Wyoming Beef Symposium, and so that'll
Absolutely.
be November 19th in Torrington, Wyoming. I guess the last thing I'd like to, make your listeners aware of is, we talked a lot about record high market prices, and
Yes.
it's a really exciting time to be a livestock production and marketing specialist. But, post-pandemic, input prices are
Right.
also a very large portion, like input costs are a lot higher right now. So,
Right.
so yeah, we do have high markets, but on the flip side of that equation, input prices are also very high.
Right. No, absolutely. That is all great. Rob, again, thank you so much. This has been our second episode of From the Cowboy State. Again, we had Rob Ziegler with University of Wyoming. My name's Michaela Getz, and thank you all so much.
Thanks for having me today, Michaela. I really appreciate it.
My name's Michaela Getz, your host, and I am an agriculture and natural resources educator with the University of Wyoming, located in Park County. University of Wyoming is an affirmative action, equal opportunity educator and employer, and don't forget that everything that the University of Wyoming Extension does is research based. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to your local extension office. And if you don't know where to find that information, please don't hesitate to just go into Google, type in uyo.edu/UWE, and you will find a full list of your local extension offices. If you have any questions, like I said, don't hesitate to reach out. This podcast and all future podcasts will be available on Spotify as well as Apple Podcast. And if you want to follow along and see what episodes will be coming up, as well as previously posted episodes, those will actually be found in a few places. You can follow along on Facebook and Instagram, and you can type in our name from the Cowboy State to find both of those pages on those social media channels. But then we will also be transcribing these episodes. So if you're not one to plug in some earplugs and listen, you can read about them, and those will be transcribed for you. And that will, for now, be housed on the Park County Extension website. So stay tuned, check those out. And again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us.